palliative care doctor, and I therefore have had my whole career has been in that field, and that has allowed me the privilege of walking with, of learning from, of caring for those who are close to the end of their life. I've worked in 4 different cities, worked in home care, worked in hospital consultation, worked in palliative care units, a range of ages, many diseases. Over the last 10 years, I've been a consultant at the civic campus of the Ottawa Hospital, where there are a lot of non-cancer, whereas most of my earlier career, cancer would have dominated in the disease reasons for being involved. At the civic, there isn't a specific set of beds, but the patients may be anywhere in any of the parts of the hospital, and our team would be mobile and go to them. One of the things that is important to be very on guard when you hear terms, the vocabulary of death and dying at this point in our culture. So when someone says palliative care, you need to ask questions about what they mean by that. Looking for terms like dying with dignity, medical aid in dying, all those kinds of euphemisms that might betray a different worldview. So I think we're pretty close to having those slides, because what I wanted to talk about was my experience from my patients of suffering and lament at the end of life. And this illustrates this particular man and his children, that even though I would do everything I knew of as a physician to control the physical symptoms of this young man, the symptoms caused by a rapidly progressive lung cancer, there's no way that I can take away the anguish in his heart or the heart of his wife, who 2 weeks after this photograph, she was left with 2 children without a husband. There was an anguish in the midst of a beautiful moment. This was taken at the hospital chapel. Their newborn child was baptized, and there was a beautiful sense of love. This is a portrait of a father's love, but it's also an image of suffering. As I'm saying that about my career and about palliative care is not about choosing death, and it's not about hastening death. Good palliative care does involve proportionate use of drugs to control those symptoms. And that use of drugs is not euthanasia. Good palliative care also involves preventing or minimizing what I would call meddlesome medicine, frantic and futile attempts to prolong life when that only is increasing suffering without having any benefit. And again, Christians need to be very careful and discerning when this is discussed, because I see a tendency of wanting to be black and white. In trying to understand a complex issue, they may decide to, in fact, stop the process of dying, trying to hold it back, feeling somehow that's the Christian thing to do, when in fact it is the wisest and the most loving and the only way that one can act. So there is a letting go, an allowing to die, that is certainly not euthanasia, and we need to understand that difference. The founder of modern palliative care, Dame Cicely Saunders, promised her patients, "You matter until the last moment of your life. We will help you to die peacefully, and we will help you to live until you die." So what is the suffering, how does it look like from my eyes in the work I do? Most people assume that the key issue is pain. And yes, an important part of my role is analyzing and managing pain, delirium, nausea, shortness of breath, the other symptoms of advancing illness. And there have been huge advances in that field. The physical sensory components of suffering can be managed if we as a society would put enough resources in this area of medicine. To date, we haven't, and that's getting worse with the push for euthanasia. This is a drawing made by a dying person. Was drawn to illustrate their suffering. And for me, the psychosocial and existential dimensions of suffering are far more important parts. Fear, anger, despair, confusion, loss of control. This sculpture was actually made by a man who was dying. And this isn't about physical pain. This is a disturbing image of his deep suffering. And when scholars have tried to look and do research into analyzing what it is about different patients who may all have physical symptoms, but why do some of them have such a deep experience of suffering, of anguish? And in combining some information from two different studies, the first was a sense of disconnection from self or others. Second, the crisis of meaning, an existential vacuum. Not being in the present, but being preoccupied by either past or future. Feeling they're a victim, feeling out of control. And I would say especially the first two are my own emphases, that there is a sense of loss of love and a loss of hope that characterizes when there is this deep anguish. The essence of palliative care is about that love and hope. There's lots of drugs, there's lots of science, there's lots of hands-on, practical, get in there and do stuff. All needs to be part of it, but it has to be wrapped in respectful trust and connection. I've been doing this work since 1975, and yes, the 70s hair was actually on me, and that's one of my first palliative care patients. This is what happens when you add a few years. At the time, I was planning to do work in overseas missions. That was what I thought the Lord had for me. And then this new mission of palliative care grabbed me, and it wouldn't let me go. So what did draw me to the work? As I look back, I see a young man who wanted to be a warrior, a knight in shining armor, St. George slaying the dragon. And there was no doubt that this area of care of the dying was an area of injustice and neglect. There was severe pain and suffering. We had come to realize we could take away most of that pain and suffering, at least the physical pains, and yet it wasn't being done because of ignorance, deception, systematic denial, lack of research. So my primary response to suffering was to take on evil, to confront it, to contain it, to destroy it, to use the tools of science and loving Christian service to make that change. And of course, there have been huge advances, both in the science of palliative care, but also in the organization of care. There were case after case like this woman who had come to a point of despair, both because of physical symptoms, but also because of the psychosocial suffering, her own sense of worthlessness, the disfigurement caused by cancer surgery. And after a lot of work by a lot of people, controlling her symptoms, giving her a supportive, life-affirming community, she told us that the last months were the most fulfilling of her entire life. But that kind of story we heard, we experienced, we told other people, and there's a danger in telling those upbeat success stories all the time, because we can too easily say that's what's possible with good palliative care without sitting in the suffering, without recognizing that there is an ugliness that comes with this process of dying and the grief that everyone is feeling. We easily can become triumphalists in our need to feel that we're overcoming evil, that we skip the cross and go directly to resurrection. We pretend not to see the residual suffering. At one point after I had been working in this field for a while, I had a time of personal crisis. Walking down a very long hospital corridor, thinking of a whole bunch of things, not paying attention to what was happening. Coming towards me was a man about my age, and I wasn't paying any attention until he was almost in front of me, and then I realized he was he had severe weight loss and showed the signs of cancer treatment. And something down deep in my gut just went, why? Why? I was so overcome. I was like, why everyone is dying around me? And I was frightened by my own reaction. I was surprised by it and frightened, and I thought, oh, this is it. I'm going nuts. I'm burning out. I'm having a crisis of faith. All of those thoughts going through my mind. But there was a period of first days and then weeks and then in some ways years of coming to grips with that reaction and coming to realize that when we can still feel that, it is a gift. You can't have it all the time. You can't keep functioning, but it is a gift to still be connected to what I came to realize was lament. And this personal lament of mine, but it was really also participation in the lament of my patients. A basic human response to suffering, an important part of how Christians and Jews dialogue with God. And I believe it has made me more sensitive and respectful of my patients' lament. It helped me, as some of the organizers were hoping to talk about today, to walk into suffering and not run away too quickly or not try to just destroy it, but to actually stand there and be part of that suffering. Behind what appears to this patient as a cry of death is in fact a cry for life, a cry for connection, of love, of hope and meaning. Every group in society, all cultures of the ancient and modern world have had this phenomenon of lamentation. Lament is not a single event, but a process of searching for meaning. It often includes a cry of despair, a cry for death, protest, rage, complaint. As Canadians, we are witnessing an horrific wave of injustice and suffering in the form of legalized euthanasia. So for the last 2.5 years, I'm on the front line. I'm dealing with this on a daily basis. with many patients where I am trying to prevent euthanasia and the system is offering it more and more blatantly. I am increasingly convinced that we are going backwards. We're reversing the advances of palliative care and increasing the burden of suffering. And in so many ways, it's our refusal as a culture to lament, using death to stifle all lament, to deceive ourselves into thinking that injected death can solve the problem of evil. The Scriptures give us a rich heritage of lament, including a third of the Psalter and many other parts of the Scriptures. For me, the most powerful are the words of our Lord on the cross, quoting the first line of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Or as one of the translations say, my roaring. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Some scholars urge us to study Psalms 22, 23, and 24 together in order to see the fullness of the lament pattern. The psalm oscillates like waves from lament to petition to trust and back again to lament. But gradually there's a progression to a fullness of trusting relinquishment and ultimately to praise. Lament leads us to the affirmation of life, to trust and worship. And I think that's key to how we need to struggle with the issues you're dealing with. It actually means we need to struggle in worship as we deal with the problem of evil. The final story the final biblical story that helped me in my work, made sense of what I was seeing at the bedside, was that of Simeon, the old man waiting to die. A just and devout man who had known lamenting until the Messiah had come. And then at the very end of his life, he had the Christ child in his arms and he shouts his praise. There was this sense of deep relinquishment that had come from a life of worship and of waiting and of lamenting in the Judaic tradition. Relinquishing even when he didn't have all the answers. I think it is in worship that we are freed to make this final relinquishment. For Simeon it was, now, Lord, let your servant depart in peace. So, in summary, in my work, as I care for this woman, I still want to be a warrior. Death is still an enemy. It's not a nice thing. The things that are happening to bring about death, we still stand against. I still want to decrease suffering. I want to stand against injustice. But I also want to be able to dwell and abide and watch with someone as they are in that lament, trying to move on myself and with them to the fullness of lament, which includes trusting relinquishment and praise of God. Thank you.